My name is Sean Saifa Wall. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am co-founder of the Intersex Justice Project, which is a project that seeks to end medically unnecessary surgeries on intersex youth and encourage supportive care and affirming care for intersex young people as well as adults. I'm currently based in Manchester, England, where I'm getting my PhD, looking at intersex rights and how they've been sort of erased from social policy in Ireland and in England. I would describe myself as like a intersex activist, a researcher, a rising scholar, although I don't really believe in the academy like that. I really love the concept of intersex justice. I mean, I think it follows a very long lineage of other sort of justice movements that have recognized the harm from systems and structures and sort of wanting to reclaim dignity and sovereignty for people with intersex variations. And so I do feel that intersex justice is a reproductive justice issue. Unfortunately, it's really overlooked. I think people within the reproductive justice movement have not really grabbed onto intersex justice, although it's so foundational to the work of reproductive justice, because we're talking about bodies, we're talking about bodily autonomy, we're talking about how the state tries to intervene in sort of bodily autonomy. So I hope that there's an increase in more awareness about how we can really build linkages between intersex rights and reproductive justice. I think when it comes to the issues that intersex people face, I think they're very many and they're very layered, right? So I think if we are talking about infants and children, we're talking about just lack of consent or involvement in the sort of medical process. We're talking about the rights of parents to sort of make these sometimes permanent decisions, especially when we're talking about surgeries on the bodies of young people with intersex variations. I think there's sort of the overreach of physicians, particularly urologists, and sort of determining intersex embodiment. But I think I feel like a lot of the conversation now just kind of leaves us talking about how medical interventions impact people with intersex variations, because there hasn't been any sort of restitution, any sort of acknowledgement of how harmful these interventions are. So I feel like the conversation stays stuck there, but I also feel like there are so many other issues that people with intersex variations deal with, right? There's issues around documentation, birth records, or securing legal documents or identity documents, especially if they have a legal sex on their documents that may not correspond to the gender that they're living in now. People may have issues from surgeries, complications from surgeries, especially if they've had more than one surgery. I mean, I've only had one and I have complications, right? Like lifelong complications. I think also there's an issue of just the culture in which these surgeries exist, which is based on a lot of shame, a lot of stigma, a lot of silence, sort of almost like collusion between parents and doctors not to sort of disclose variations or to not tell the complete and full truth of how a person was born and what happened to them. I think there's just a lot of room and a lot of space to actually learn more, right? About sort of the complexities of sort of intersex people's lives. It makes me think, one, just about the mental health aspect So I think what has been consistent um, in in Europe as well as in the United States, and I'm talking about a Western context, right? And it's not to say that there isn't sort of intersex activism happening in different parts of the globe, right? Like I do want to shout out folks in the global South, people in Mexico, people in countries in Africa, people in Asia, and sort of like folks in Bangladesh, folks in India, who are working for change and inclusion. But just to sort of kind of throw out something from the Western context is that, you know, intersex young people contend with higher rates of anxiety and depression compared to their peers, right? And so I feel like, you know, if we can sort of interrupt this sort of cycle of surgery, then, you know, I'm wondering what else becomes possible. But I think in addition to that, I think about like how intersex people contend with more than just surgery, right? Because we're human beings, right? And we exist in society, and there are ways in which our embodiments and just sort of impacts how we're received in the world and the type of care we get. So for me, I think, you know, the focus of my work is also just like, how do we get supportive and affirming healthcare for intersex adults? I think, you know, just at a basic level, I think it would be important for midwives to really learn about what intersex is. Just because, you know, there's an assumption for people who are in the know, right, that intersex variations can occur in up to 2% of the population. But that doesn't take into account, I think that takes into account people who are readily identified by the medical establishment as having an intersex variation. But it doesn't account for people who have diversity in their sex characteristics, because the reality is that we all have diversity in our sex characteristics, right? I was looking at, because I'm constantly in the literature, I was looking at a study from 1995 where urologists found that in a sample of 500 men, that 55% were sort of deemed normal, right? So 45% of the men had what was referred to as a hypospadic penis, where the urethra is sort of like underneath the head or closer to the base of the penis, somewhere along the shaft, right? When there are sort of more extreme, not extreme, but more variation in sort of hypospadias, the urethra can be sort of behind the ball sack. It can be sometimes there can be like an opening underneath where the penis is. So there's so much variation, right? And I think we don't really account for this variation in our bodies. And so I think, you know, in the chance if a midwife is at the birth of a child where there is some sort of variation in their sex characteristics, I think it's a matter of just presenting it to the parent as if this is a normal variation, because we all have variations in our sex characteristics. But unfortunately, when a child is born with a variation in their sex characteristics, it's treated as a medical emergency, especially if there's some ambiguity or atypicality in the genitals. And so I think it's really about educating the parents before birth, right? Especially if parents, if they are doing if they're conceiving by IVF, and they're doing prenatal screening, you know, often those prenatal screenings, you know, bring up different chromosome variations, right? So actually talking to the parents about like different chromosome variations and that, you know, these children are normal, because what often happens is that when parents, if they do any sort of prenatal screening and they find that their child has an intersex variation, which could be Turner's, which is XO, just one X chromosome, or Klinefelter's, which is XXY, a lot of those sort of variations, those fetuses that have those variations, end in abortion, right? And so I think even before a child is born is really sort of talking to parents and sort of normalizing that there can be a variation in genitals, there can be a variation in chromosomes, there can be a variation in hormones, and that the child is not normal. There are very few intersex variations that require medical intervention, where there's like a medical emergency. And I think often it's sort of presented as a medical emergency, and it's presented as a medical emergency because there's some sort of like atypicality in the genitals, right? And it's an alarmist around gender, right? Because again, intersex bodies are used to sort of reaffirm the gender binary, right? And to sort of soothe our anxieties that we have around gender. So I think it's sort of that prenatal preparation. And then I think, really sort of the midwives educating themselves, really educating the parents. And I think also, yeah, just I think for me it's just like that education more than anything else, right? And a normalizing and really being advocates for parents, because I think, birthing is such a very stressful process. Every birthing parent I've talked to, couples that I've spoke to who've delivered have been really stressed out, right? And it can be very isolating, it can be very lonely, and especially if endocrinologists, pediatricians, urologists are presenting them with conflicting information or contradictory information, that contradicts what they expected, then it can create conditions and circumstances where children are subject to medical intervention. So, I think about how midwives can be allies in this process to parents. And I think it, again, comes back to education. And one more thing. I think also it's also a matter of midwives being able to look at different types of genitals. Because they're, if someone has an intersex variation, whether they have a diagnosed intersex variation or not, people's genitals just look really different. And so the thing is like, how do we also sort of educate ourselves, but also just normalize the fact that people have different bodies, people have different genitals, people have different genders who are giving birth, right? So yeah, just wanted to add that as well. I think about like what it means. I think about the role of midwives, because I feel for a long time, and I read that, midwives historically have been a threat to the rise of the medical establishment, right? That men who were doctors were threatened by midwives and outlawed midwifery, right? So I think there's sort of in the institutionalization of midwifery, how do midwives still act as advocates for parents and in some ways challenge medical authority? And I think I don't know how that would happen, right? But I think, I think about in what ways can midwives be subversive and subvert the system? I get curious about that. And sort of support each other, right? In sort of education and learning and continuing to learn about the issues that affect intersex adults. Because, the reality is that the children who have been intervened on grow into adults, right? So I think it could behoove people to really learn about the experiences of intersex adults in order to stop and interrupt these surgeries in childhood, So, I'm about education, I'm about collective sort of power, and using that collective power to actually challenge medical authority. I think, and also to put it in context, right, that colonization and medicine are part of the colonial project. right? And that people prior to colonization, people had different understandings of gender and sexuality. People had different understandings of bodies, right? And I think, you know, in these places like Kenya, like South Africa, Uganda, where these sort of like infant killings have taken place or are taking place, you know, it's no surprise that these are former British colonies, right? And so, but what's interesting is that I have comrades in South Africa, and I was talking to some younger activists in South Africa who are in conversation with midwives, right? And, you know, do that education to sort of be like, you know, these children are born differently. They're not an omen, they're not a curse, they're not devils, and that they can grow to be healthy, loving, productive human beings, right? And you know, I laugh at myself using the term productive, but you know, I feel like those interventions, right? Like that's an activist intervention, sort of like really engaging on a community level with seeing this issue, seeing this problem, seeing this this brutality that's taking place, and as opposed to joining the ruckus to say that, oh, those people in those global South nations are so backwards or so ignorant, blah blah blah, to really put what's happening in context and actually engage with practitioners and hopefully kind of bring about the slow death of these sort of infant killings. Really important for people to sort of use language that people use for themselves, right? So around identity, around body parts, around how they talk about it, their experience, because there's a lot of people who don't identify as intersex. There are people who do, a lot of people don't. So I think it's a matter of just not assuming that if someone is seeking assistance in some way that they identify as intersex. And I think also sort of recognizing that I feel that whether someone has had medical intervention or not, I think it can be trauma. I definitely think that there is trauma, whether it's a personal experience of trauma or whether it's vicarious trauma. So I think also practitioners recognizing that the person that they're speaking with or working with may have some element of trauma, right? And sort of being able to engage in trauma-informed care. And I think also sort of like really in some way, you know, depending on the person's experience, you know, connecting them to just other people who are intersex, right? Because I think there's something that happens, and I even saw it with myself, but I continue hearing this story of there are people who identify with their variation, right? Or may see that, oh, I have hypospadias, I have CAH, I have this, but don't necessarily make the link with intersex, right? There are people who know about intersex and who totally are like, I'm not intersex, right? But there are other people who don't know about intersex. And they're just kind of like out here, not really tapped in, right? So it's just like, how can midwives be a bridge for people who may want to seek community with other intersex folks?